Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all, whichever part of the world you are in today, because we are officially live in the official Facebook page of the International Astronomical Union Office for Astronomy Outreach, or IAU-OAO. And give them a like, support, so you can be updated to other astronomy outreach events. And also, we are also live in PAGASA official Facebook page. Before we get started, we would like to go over a few reminders for everyone to participate actively in today's event. First, as displayed in the slide shown prior to the start of the webinar, we would like to remind everyone to please mute your microphones, turn off your cameras, and pin the speaker screen once the speaker starts the presentation. This is to avoid unnecessary distractions. Also, the participants will have the opportunity to submit their text questions to our presenter by typing the questions in the question box in the Google Meet control panel. Lastly, we will be providing certificate of attendance to those who will stay with us until the end of the program. We will be also sending the link to the survey of the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. To formally begin our program, let us hear from Dr. Esperanza Opuyanan, PAGASA's Administrator for Research and Development, for her opening and welcome address.
Thank you very much, Nico. Am I loud and clear? Hello,
Yes, ma'am.
magandang
You are
hapon.
loud and clear.
Okay, thank you, Nico. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all, whichever part of the world you are in today. On behalf of our administrator, Dr. Vicente Malano, I am very honored to extend a warm welcome to everyone who are joining us today, most especially to our eminent resource speaker, Mr. Timothy James Dimacali from the DOST, for sparing us his precious time to share his knowledge and expertise about ethnoastronomy. I also cordially welcome all participants who are joining this webinar via Google Meet and Facebook live streaming, including our PAGASA colleagues, teachers, students, astronomy club members, astronomy enthusiasts, our international friends, and everyone here present. We really appreciate your presence today. This October 1st until October 4, we are celebrating 100 hours of astronomy, 100 oras ng astronomiya, a special around-the-globe science outreach event organized by the International Astronomical Union Office of Astronomy Outreach, or IAU-OAO. The theme of this year's celebration is Together Under One Sky, inspired by how our community managed to become together even during this time of pandemic when physical contact is still not possible in many places. In celebration of the 100 hours of astronomy, PAGASA is hosting a webinar session about ethnoastronomy in the Philippines. Ethnoastronomy deals with the people's understanding and belief of astronomical phenomenon on their culture. Even during the pre-Hispanic era, the Philippines already had their own constellations. From the published journal article entitled Balatik, Katutubong Bituin ng Mga Pilipino by Dr. Dante Ambrosio, the father of Philippine ethnoastronomy. He mentioned that even before the colonizers came to the country, various ethnic groups already had their respective set of constellations. Our ancestors used prominent star groups such as Balatik or Orion constellation and Moroporo, the open star cluster of Pleiades, for marking the seasons of hunting, planting, and sailing, especially at those times our ancestors only rely in nature. Today's session is important for us Filipinos because it will give us an opportunity to know more about our culture and history and how those mold identity as a Filipino and as a nation. Ms. Diane Manzano, a language professor from University of the Philippines, Los Baños, Department of Humanities, emphasized that learning ethnoastronomy is beneficial to our nation building as it proves the ancient Filipino societies were not lacking in the field of science and technology. Ethnoastronomy is not so popular in the country, but I hope that today's session, looking back to our rich ancient culture, will provide more insights about who we are as Filipinos and what molded us into being uniquely Pinoy. I wish that our international friends here will also enjoy today's session. I hope everybody can learn from this webinar and that it will be fruitful and engaging. So let us all stay on and hear from the lecture of our special resource speaker for today, Mr. Timothy James Dimacali. Good afternoon, good evening, or have a nice day to everyone. Maraming salamat po.
Good
Thank you,
afternoon.
Rhiannon. So now without further ado, may we call on Ms. Maria Rosario C. Ramos, the officer in charge of the Space Science and Astronomy section, to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Nico. Dr. Kayan, and the Deputy Administrator for Research and Development. Dr. Servando, the Chief of the Research and Development and Training Division. PAGASA colleagues, friends, participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my pleasure and great privilege to introduce our resource speaker for this afternoon's webinar for 100 Hours of Astronomy. He is a science, journalist, and communicator. He is a graduate of Bachelor of Arts in English at the University of the Philippines. In 2017, he was awarded as the first Filipino to receive the first Fulbright scholarship at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he finished his Master of Science degree in Science Writing in 2018. His thesis title is From the Sea to the Stars, The Forgotten Journeys of the Philippines' Ancient Explorers. He is the founding editor of the GMA News Online for Science and Technology section. His current affiliations: Project Technical Specialist, Department of Science and Technology, Science Education Institute, Chief Foresight Editor and Communications Consultant, National Academy of Science and Technology, Writing Consultant for Data Science, Asian Institute of Management, Aboitiz, School of Innovation, Technology, and Entrepreneurship. Consultant for Science Communication, Philippine Genome Center, Probe Media Foundation, Incorporated. Contributor to Asian Scientist Magazine, Wild Type Media, Batobalani Magazine. Consultant and guest lecturer for Science and Society Program at UP Diliman. Recipients of various awards and fellowship given abroad for his diligence as a science journalist. He is the chief editor of Tanaw 2050, Science, Technology, and Innovation Foresight in 2021. Editor, Filipino Genome Research Program, Research Communication and Ethics Instrument 2020. Among his recent publications are those I have mentioned. He also participated in various conferences, courses, seminars in science communications here and abroad. He is a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2017 to 2018. President of ICT Journalists Association of the Philippines from 2015 to 2017, and founding member of Science and Technology Society, SDS, Philippine Society from 2015 to present. Ladies and gentlemen, It is a pride and honor to introduce and welcome Mr. Timothy James M. Dimacali, who will talk about the ethnoastronomy in the Philippines.
Hello. Thank you very much for the introduction. I just want, and I'm very excited to share all of this with you this afternoon or this morning to whoever's listening outside of the country. Before I begin my presentation, just wanted to say that for me, and I think for a lot of us, if I may go into the vernacular and pardon our foreign audiences, but um, malaking bagay sa akin to, yung pag-explore ko ng ethnoastronomy. It was important for me to explore ethnoastronomy because it was a way for me, especially when I was studying abroad, to get back to my roots, to understand a part of my culture and history that I felt detached from. And what I've found in my journeys, although I have to admit, despite everything that I've read and put together, I am by far not an expert. There are lots of uh, research that has yet to be done, and there are experts, particularly in Polynesian ethnoastronomy and wayfinding, who are much more knowledgeable about the craft than I am. But what I'd like to share with you today is uh, it's not a full story, then at least the strands of a tapestry that we have yet to see, we have yet to fully understand. And that's what I will endeavor to talk about right now. As I will share my slides. Hold on, please. There. Okay. Can everyone see the slides properly? Hello? Are we okay?
Yung the Google Meet is showing sa TJ.
Oo.
Uh,
Hold on.
wala yung presentation.
Wala yung presentation. Sorry. My apologies. I'm still getting used to Google Meets. Hold on, please. Sorry about this. I can't seem to share my screen.
Sir, you can choose the share
I'm
a tab
sorry.
screen yung sa share a tab.
Yes, hindi lumalabas yung ano eh. Hindi lumalabas yung here. Hindi siya lumalabas yung ano, yung PowerPoint tab.
Maybe siguro sir, sa Google Meet, yung window na Google Meet is active. So, pwede siguro i-minimize na lang natin yung tab na yun. Then, siguro it will share or it will show
Okay.
the
Okay. I'll try to share my entire screen.
tab.
Yeah, I've been trying to share either a window or there. It doesn't appear in the window options. I'm sorry. So now you should be seeing my Google Meet. Oops, no.
And we can see the
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
yung
hold
YouTube.
on.
There, sir. Okay na pa. You can see now
Sorry.
the presentation.
Although you can still see my desktop online. Yeah. Sorry, apologies
Yeah, yeah.
for the technical difficulties. Okay, so this talk is From the Sea to the Stars, the Forgotten Journeys of the Philippines' Ancient Explorers. As I said, when we look at Philippine history, even in the present day, we tend to think, we as a people are generally very hungry for Pinoy pride moments, right? Trying to understand our place in the world and our contributions to the world. No? And that is why, not surprisingly, we have a lot of current the current popularity of say um, uh, mythology and others, But this was something that also drove me when I did my forays into ethnoastronomy, and I found that the Philippines has a lot of stories that have yet to be told of these ancient explorers. So my talk will go this way. We will set the stage by talking about the arrival of people in the Philippines and beyond. Uh, I want to talk about how the Philippines role specifically as a geographical location towards exploration of a vast portion of the world, and how difficult it was to go into this exploration, which is called the Great Austronesian Expansion. But after we set that stage, I would like to take a quick step back, very short, only to talk about Western navigational tools, so that we can, because these are somewhat more familiar to us, and also how we can use that as a way to complement and to compare the frameworks, the mindset of the people who use these tools versus Austronesian navigational tools, wayfinding and ethnoastronomy specifically, how these two systems of thought compare to each other. Then we will go specifically into Philippine ethnoastronomy. I'll be playing a short video for you guys. And then at the end of that, we'll talk about further challenges. But the story of Philippine ethnoastronomy goes far, far back, many thousands of years, to the time when people first came to the Philippines. I'm talking specifically of Calauman and the Kalinga tool makers. These are fossils that showed that the Philippines had been populated at least 500,000 years ago. These are two different sets of fossils. Uh, First of all, the most famous of which was later Calauman, which was found to be Homo luzonensis. It was confirmed to be a new species of human, uh, and it was shown that they had arrived in the Philippines at least 67,000 years ago. Even older than that are the Kalinga fossils, which date back to 700,000 years ago. The problem with the Kalinga fossils is that these were not remains of people per se, but these were the remains of a rhinoceros, which was found to have been butchered. There were tool marks, there were scratches that indicate that a rhinoceros carcass had been systematically cut and eaten. And this was dated to 700,000 years old. But we have yet to find the actual people who ate the rhinoceros. There are no fossils yet. But the tool marks show us that the Philippines, these particular areas in Luzon, the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines, were inhabited by people over half a million years ago already. But here's the thing. So we have people in the Philippines, half a but studies of the Philippines geographic landmass show that even at the last glacial maximum, when waters were at their lowest, and it's believed that a lot of the land masses in Asia were joined together, you will notice in this time lapse here that Luzon and much of the northern part of the Philippines, actually, even I think Palawan, there, were still surrounded by water. At no point was Luzon ever completely connected to any other landmass by a land bridge. So there was always deep water surrounding it. And that raises a very important question. How did humans get to Luzon in particular? How did humans get to the Philippines? There are studies that show that at least in the southern parts of the Philippines and Southeast Asia in general, during the ice ages, land mass, the waters were indeed lower, and that people likely and animals likely traveled through these areas now. But in Luzon in particular, since it was always cut off, the big question is how were these expanses of water covered? Now, archaeologists, of course, are cautious. We don't want to say that because for lack of evidence, we really don't know for certain how they arrived. Simply, it could have been simply through, you know, baka naanod sila. They could have through a storm they might have got hitched a ride on flotsam jetsam floating through and found their way accidentally to the Philippines. But we cannot also rule out the possibility that it was a deliberate migration, that somehow perhaps these ancient peoples, ancient humans, came here using technology, boat building technology. We really don't know, and so far there is no evidence yet of this. To be fair, and it's really difficult to come by because by the nature of boats, they're of course made of wood. They easily rot, and given the wet conditions, it's really difficult for these things to be preserved. But the possibility remains. And if they did travel through with boats, as anthropologist Felipe Hocano pointed out, that says a lot about the level of sophistication and the level of technology that they had, and this raises questions, particularly about how their societies were organized. Because for you to build something as complicated as a boat, you would not only need the tools to make it, but also the communication skills and the need to preserve this knowledge over generations, so that you can create a relatively complex piece of technology and use it over succeeding generations. Certainly, around 1,000 years ago, as late as 1,000 years ago, we've seen that people were already scattered across the Pacific Oceans. This is called the Great Austronesian Migration. And what the genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence shows us is that most likely people came through Asia, through to Taiwan, into the Philippines, and into Southeast Asia, into Borneo, and then used these areas as a jump-off point to exploring the rest of the Pacific Ocean. So what you see here is a very common map, the Bellwood map, if I'm not mistaken, that shows a prevalent theory about the dispersal of people through these areas and how long ago it happened. But you will notice here, of note to this particular talk, is that the Philippines was a jump-off point for these explorations, and that's something that amazed me, right? Because I didn't. Although we are still coming, I'm aware that we are part of, and perhaps some of you in the audience are also aware of, that we are a part of this Austronesian heritage, and that we are closely tied to these peoples. It came as a surprise to me, and I was frankly amazed. I'm still amazed at where the Philippines possibly fits into this whole picture of migration. And actually, as I was saying, there's even genetic evidence, not direct, not from archaeological evidence that points to, the the um, a movement of people back and forth through Southeast Asia, through the Polynesian islands, back and forth into the Philippines and beyond. This particular study, which came out in 2014, shows that Polynesian chickens were traced to a very particular species of chicken that still exists today in the Philippines. So does that mean that Polynesians came through directly from the Philippines? Maybe, maybe not. But it does suggest that it does suggest that there was common movement between the Philippines and Polynesia back and forth, such that at some point in the distant past, someone came through the Philippines, found these chickens, found them delicious maybe, and then brought them with them in their journeys as they moved through to the rest of these Pacific islands. No? And as a matter of fact, there are also records that show as late as the 1800s, 1700s and 1800s, there are documented cases where people from Palau would find themselves in the Philippines, and then they would set off again. So there was always this dynamic movement of people through this area, and the Philippines played a very important role in that movement. So now, before we go into ethnoastronomy, let's do a quick brief overview of Western navigational tools. So what we're looking at here is an astrolabe, and it's said that the astrolabe was the iPhone of its day. It's a very beautiful device, very elegant, and for its time, very complex. An astrolabe was in fact found in a Philippine shipwreck, not as Austronesian, but one of the Spanish ships that plied the Mexico-Acapulco route, the San Diego. There was in the wreck found this particular astrolabe. So we know that it was used by later sailors during the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And there it is. No? And we can see from this exploded view that it was a relatively complex instrument. No? But what the astrolabe did was this part over here that you see labeled as the wreath with all of these little curlicues. You know? These were actually pointers, indicators that pointed to the plate and pointed to where particular stars would be found at a given time in the night sky. So the way that an astrolabe would be used to simplify things is, if you knew the positions of the stars, you could use it to figure out the positions of the stars where you were along a certain latitude. You can shift the plates, the wreath, in such a way that it aligns up with what you see in the sky, and that would give you the time of that the time of that marking. And you can do it the other way around. Given a particular time, you can shift the plates around so that you can see on the astrolabe what the stars patterns would look like in the sky at that particular time in that particular latitude. The plate differs depending, you could switch it out, because depending on the latitudes, the patterns, the markings would change on the plate. No? And this is what that looks like. This is a more modern representation. I've seen examples of modern day, wouldn't say replicas, but modern versions of astrolabes where they replaced that wreath, that thing with the pointers, with an acrylic plate or an acrylic wreath that showed the star patterns as they are in the sky. So that makes it clearer. No? Instead of using those little curlicues, instead of using those little pointers, if you used an acrylic plate or a glass plate, you could actually, then it would make the star patterns more readable, more understandable. But of course, using this on the ship, where glass could easily break, a full metal astrolabe was easier to carry and less likely to be broken. This is an actual example of an astrolabe, 7th century astrolabe from Harvard, and you'll see on the left there's that reed, as I mentioned earlier, with all of those little points that represent particular star patterns as they move about in the sky. And here is a modern reproduction. As I said, it makes it, hopefully it's more understandable this way, to modern audiences, where instead of those metal points, you see the stars, the constellations as they appear in the sky in this particular example. And you can move that around so that you can see what the stars look like at a particular time of the night or a particular time of the year at that latitude. So that was how people understood latitude. The problem is, of course, when you're traveling, you also need to know the longitude. It took a long time for the West to come up with a way to accurately figure out longitude, because if you use through the use of the astrolabe, you could easily figure out your latitude, how far up north or south you are, because the patterns of the stars shift northwards or upwards, right, depending on where you are. But for you to know the longitude, in the same way today, right, we're used to thinking of longitude today in terms of time zones, right? For instance, if it's 8 a.m. here in the US, in the East, it's like 8 p.m., right? So obviously there's a time difference. But when you're on a ship, the only accurate way you could figure out that difference is if you had a really accurate clock, which didn't come around until 1735. Before then, people used dead reckoning. They would use various tools to estimate how far they had gone from a particular point, so that they had a very rough idea of where they were in relation to where they set sail, so east or west, right? It was fraught with errors, and at least in the West, it was only in 1735 when a really accurate and reliable clock could be manufactured to tell them specifically what time it was back where they were, or from where they came from, and they could compare that to the time of day that they had at their position, so they could figure out their longitude. We see that being used here, no? And this is how at least English ships figured out their longitude. So at a particular place, when they're at a particular place and it's high noon, they compare that to the time on their chronometer, because they know that it's high noon where they are versus the time that the local time where they came from. So that difference will give them an idea of how far they had traveled. But here we come to where East and West meet. What we're looking at now is a map drawn by Tupaya, a navigator who Captain Cook encountered in his travels. And Tupaya was a traditional navigator in the Austronesian sense, and we'll touch on the techniques that they used before. No? But you will note that Austronesians and Filipinos also, for that matter, we did not rely on maps. We did not rely on these technologies. We did not have an equivalent of the astrolabe. And more so, we did not have accurate clocks like that. What we did rely on was memory. There was, instead of figuring out specific points and then logging them, etc., much of the information for wayfinding and much of the information for moving about was through oral tradition. And as the ethnoastronomy is a key part of that, and which I'll show later, because by understanding how the stars moved about in the sky, you had a fair and memorizing that, having an entire system of knowledge based around that, a whole mythology based around that. You could not just find out where you are, but conveniently pass on that knowledge to future generations. What we're looking at here is a map of the Pacific Islands, but if you lay this map on top of an actual map, it doesn't fit. The islands do exist, but the distances are different. This is because Tupaya, when he was communicating these to Captain Cook, he was relying more on his memory and how these islands were connected in his mind, more than relying on actual measurements between them, which is why the dimensions of this map are a bit squished. So that raises this idea, this thought about how we compare these Western technologies versus Austronesian Eastern technologies of navigation. We tend to think that technology evolves in progression, in hierarchical progression, right? That you have something rudimentary, like like a stone tool, tapos you continue to make it better and better, improve on it until tada, you have an atomic bomb, right? But that's not necessarily true. Technological evolution is like biological evolution in the sense that it doesn't have this intrinsic hierarchy of improvement, right? When we develop tools, we develop them based on what is available and what is most appropriate to our needs. So when we think about ethnoastronomy and wayfinding and Austronesian Polynesian methods that don't use that don't use astrolabes, that don't use GPS, we don't, and we shouldn't think of them as backward. We shouldn't think of them as anything less than what we have today, because these were developed by these people, by our people, using what they had, and it suited their ways of life. We'll note that in the Philippines, for instance, in pre-colonial times, we did have writing, systems of writing. We did a lot of writing, but we did not, and we also didn't. We did not have complex libraries that we see elsewhere in the world. No? Neither do we have large monuments here in much of not Southeast Asia. In much of Polynesia, we do not see large monuments, except Rapa Nui perhaps being an exception. But that doesn't mean that these people were backwards. It simply means, among other things, that this was what people found to be most efficient and most useful to them as a culture. So another way of thinking about this, when these technologies, because they don't have this hierarchical order, when you bring a technology into a certain area, something quote unquote high tech, the people who receive it will adapt that technology to their culture, to their worldview, right? And they will be, and vice versa. Sometimes they will try to meet the users of that new technology halfway. And that's what we see in Tupaya's map, right? It's neither here nor there. It's not an entirely Western map. It's not an entirely Eastern or Austronesian map. It was Tupaya's attempt, in a way, to bridge those two worlds. In the same way that if you give a caveman a lighter, they might not understand how it works. They might not understand why it works. They might think it's magic, but they will eventually learn to use it in ways that the inventor might never have imagined. We see this happening even today. In the Philippines, I can remember two examples. First of all, the way back in the day when we adopted SMS, short messaging systems, we used to think of when SMS was invented, it was basically just a quick way to send a message. But we as a culture, when we took it over, we developed our own language. We were even able to develop animations using SMS. No? Another example of that is even today, blades in Batangas. Batangas is famous for the manufacture of balisongs and other blades, but they use leaf steel. That's often found, that is usually found in the springs of cars. No? So they would take old used cars, use the springs to make blades. No? Again, it's an adaptation of a different technology to suit their needs, their worldview. So let's pull back and think about the Austronation navigational tools. No? As I said, much of Austronesia and in the Philippines also, we don't rely on handheld tools to find the way. You will all remember this particular scene from Moana, where she keeps putting her hand up to the sky, right? And we all know the song, and some of you are probably singing it in your heads right now. And this was an actual technique that was used. What would happen is that they would use the hand breadth to look at, not just here's one example. Now they would look at how far Polaris or the North Star was up in the sky relative to the knuckles of their hands. That would help give them an versus the horizon. That would give them an estimation of what their latitude was based on how far up or down Polaris was in the sky. And they could use this also to look at other patterns in the sky to indicate, to give them an idea of where they were. They also had an extensive knowledge of star patterns that they passed on through oral traditions. What we're looking at here is just a layout of the skies of the skies as it was known to Austronesian navigators. And what you're looking at around the circle are the various stars that are expected to rise up in the horizon, that they're expected to see in any particular cardinal direction. And what was amazing about all of this is that a navigator had to memorize something like 200 stars. They had to know for instance, when a particular star came up in a particular part of the sky, what that star was, and they would have to anticipate what other stars would come up later as the time went on at night. They would know what stars came out where at what times of the year, and so they would always look to the horizon to figure out where they were and what time of day it was. So there's a lot to that Moana song when they say when she sings that she's looking where the sky meets the sea, the horizon. It did call to her people, to our ancestors, to our people, in this very rich way, because when we think about navigating by the stars, a lot of people tend to point upwards, right? The stars above guide me, but to them it was actually the horizon. The horizon was very important because that was what they would look to see the patterns of the stars as they came up in the horizon. That would guide their journeys. But that was not the only tool that they used. No? The Austronesians also had a very deep understanding of waves and how waves bounced off islands in the distance. What we're looking at here is a stick chart. I can't read it, and a lot of people can't. The people who use them, these varied from person to person. These were not necessarily passed down, no? And these were not carried on board the ship. The stick charts or the stick maps were actually a tool that was used to teach kids and would-be navigators how waves bounced off islands. What we're looking at here, each of the stones represent particular islands, and the stick patterns that you see represented how the waves bounced off that islands. So when they were in the middle of the ocean, even though they could not see land from afar, just by understanding looking at the waves and feeling them under them, they could they could understand whether not just whether they were near land, but also what land masses they were approaching. So if you can imagine, there's this huge body of knowledge that incorporates all of this, no? The movement of the stars in the sky, the way that waves hit far away islands. They even had, I'll go back a bit now, they even had knowledge of what birds to look for in the sky, because they knew that seabirds could only travel a certain distance away from islands. So if they saw a particular species of bird, they knew they were a certain distance away from a particular group of islands. They knew, okay, this bird comes from this island, it can only travel so far, therefore we're near that island, etc. So it's a rich body of knowledge that's passed on, and it was such a complex body of knowledge that according to researchers, it would take decades to pass on this knowledge to would-be navigators. 20 it took one modern day navigator 20 years or more before he could do it on his own. Which brings us to Philippine ethnoastronomy. So before I continue with Philippine ethnoastronomy, the situation in the Philippines was that, of course, not all of our people, regardless of how we came to these islands, some of us moved on to pushed forward into the great unknown of the Pacific and eventually populated the Pacific Islands. But of course, a lot of us stayed behind. And we developed our own systems of understanding the sky that are no less complex than these systems that are developed to explore the Pacific. They are all of these systems. They they have commonalities across the Philippines, and which we'll endeavor to show in a while. But what we're looking at now is the cover of the book Balatik, Ethnoastronomy, Kalangitan sa Kabias ng Pilipino by Dante Ambrosio, who is considered the father of Philippine ethnoastronomy because he was the first and so far the only person to create a comprehensive compilation of all of these ethnoastronomical traditions in the country. And the cover features very specifically what a balatik is. Balatik, it goes by various names in the country, but it is a kind of boar trap. And it is this boar trap that a lot of our people saw in the sky as the pattern when they see Orion. So the Western astronomy considers Orion as the figure of the hunter, but Filipinos across the country saw it as this boar trap. And before we continue, I would like to show you this video that we made earlier this year. So what we did was we tried to trace Dr. Ambrosio's footsteps in Tawi-Tawi. We tried to interview people and get to know if the traditions were alive and well. And I will stop sharing this for a while. Oops. And I will share the video. You guys there? Hello, sorry.
Yes, sir.
Figure
We're
out.
here.
Thank you. Okay, sorry. There you go. I will share the video. Hold on, please. May audio naman?
Yes, sir. Meron pa. Ano?
Okay, thank you.
Na pangandaan kami mabati na bang sa pamana palua siya dali ilaw yan na pangandaan ni kamatuahan aniya na yung na panon masalog laang buson Uy ko si Bandoya sa Bilani umur ko 70 na makasa na yahilang ko magdaing. Abag sa ataya sa atenan bangat bang pa deo na sulubinan na nan pangalindi. Dapat sa tong paano na ya tambay to tong pareo na ya. Tong patoho na ba na pangingi kami bangan so na amole na kami. Daya ba tikinanan niya ayo kami pupu. Bangay na tagay sinamamahire na naabo na raing. Pasod na ni tebaraing. Bangsa na mamahinang bala na buraing.
Ang talampad is the Filipino term. Ito yung Filipino word para sa constellations. And yung balatik naman, ito yung tawag sa Orion's Belt. Tinawag siya na balatik kasi mukha daw siyang parang patibong. Ang balatik kasi is parang hunting trap ayon sa ating mga katutubo o ayon sa mga indigenous groups. Alam naman natin na ang Pilipinas ay isang diverse country and hindi tayo homogeneous. May kanya-kanya tayong mga kultura. So ang ethnoastronomy is a way of binding all Filipinos para maintindihan natin kung ano ba ang nangyayari sa kalangitan para makalakas din ang identity natin bilang Pilipino.
Ya, may makapano maakot yung kamatuan kami. May ako pinapatahan sigala. Na supaya bang kami ang usaha, ako le sadya. Bang ba pakay kami ya papatakamatuan ba kami ako le.
Ni harus saban batili mo sa ita saga one time sango ma ya paduman kami tu ya Alexia ya kompas mumu sa bate mikit ya kompas naan pag pikit kompas asa sabi kita bate saga nya ko anda ro asal paduman nan sa tatalubin ditunda ne ko kasi tandaan din na ro bang pakabiglan sa tandaan ya saga ya na pindah lik na munda ta bata dari sa bate saga magano mabaliw. Kasi mo time to baliw pinday ya ba pambimin bulian bimin kid ya baliw tayo sa maglegot ya
meron silang traditional na kaalaman at itong mga iba't ibang indigenous communities natin or indigenous groups and dun ko nakita yung work ni Dr. Dante Ambrosio. Si Dr. Dante Ambrosio ay isang dating faculty ng University of the Philippines, Diliman. Actually siya ang nag-iisang eksperto natin sa bansa pagdating sa ethnoastronomy. So pinablish niya yung kanyang libro na Balatik or Ethnoastronomia or Kalangitan at sa Kabihas ng Pilipino noong 2011. Ito yung isang libro na nag-codify or naglimbag ng halos lahat or karamihan ng kaalaman ng ating mga dalubhasa pagdating sa ethnoastronomy dito sa Pilipinas.
Sa astronomy, like for example, dito sa mga paghahanap buhay, meron silang mga understanding that if it is done at this particular point in time, wala kang ma-encounter na difficulty, walang malaking alon.
tukod no bat ano ba lahat bang nagtamarilout na ano kita ba na hekaro sa man ko mamahi na barata Na ipagtuwa rin tayo at sa katabang makita sa report yung pinagtuwa ito makarumbuta. Hekalo sa mamay. So di kayo yan yan da reta mata jaringan da pahekanan. At least pati le ako te nga sigala pati assistant ya assistant kapitan.
So yun ang importansya ng stars. Parang nakaano na rin, kasama na rin sa kanilang traditional knowledge system. That if they follow certain yung itong tala, they follow the stars, alam naman nila kung aling stars at a certain time of the night.
Na atya maaari talangan dito yan rupa ang sabot bubulu rupa taga mamahi yan bang waktu pagdainginan ya ketika ring mahi kana ni taga mamahi deyom na. Bang halaman na mamahi deyom na halaman na tayong balan aburaing. Pasal papata kamatuahan bang aniya na tanda niya majilom na mamahi na yung na timpu aniya na raing. Timpu sa buraing na.
Meron tayong kultura na kung saan ginagamit din natin ang kalangitan para makapaglayag or makapagtanim ng nasa tamang panahon.
Maraming klase kasi yung sama na rin naninirahan sa tabing dagat. Meron namang mga sama na naninirahan sa bukid. So ito ay nakaukit sa kanilang traditional na system. At saka yung kanilang hanap buhay nakakonekta dito sa kanilang lokasyon.
Banan kami ang maghuhuma, tinanuman kami ginis-ginis usab. Ya panghati kami, kami bang sasama, ya balatik tutu, bang kami bang sasama, ya na tutu hati na palyama. Ya na kami mamahitalo pag eli.
Hati na para maghuhuma ya important. Yan na niyonan palyama. Pasal palyama tu bobo history na di kayo ya maghuhuma. Pas dua ya hekahanda na. Pas yan na maghuhuma, bari na ni tigara ni jaya ni kayo na nabasan din na. Gusto na taghanda na, dalik na sulikun. Bari, gusto na yanda na tutubet yung magkahagad ba iya. Nanulik. Na pag nanulik si jari na labo bari na plastik na taghanda na mole na ako ni jata langit kita tutu manalum juga tutu makamlik na mga mundusia tahamban daga hindi siya ako bang maghuhumana taabot ako lik na bang ibarat lik na ulaw sigalisag siyam nagda na kam na bas taabot lik na ako bang ibarat ulaw sa lisag subukay sa nakataw nga nuno na kam. Pasalik na pangulan na. Bo kamlik na magtanom na. Dagahin bi akulik na pasalik na majalom dan tahun. Minduwalik na sisun pagtatanom. Pasalik na paglid ko na toongan. Niya panas low yana summer na.
Yung sinasabi na makikita ang balatik sa bandang alas 9 posisyon sa kalangitan, pag buwan ng Disyembre, ito yung sinasabi nila na ang balatik ay nasa alas 9 posisyon sa kalangitan. Yung sinasabi naman na makikita ang balatik sa alas 11 posisyon sa kalangitan, kadalasan ito ay mararanasan o makikita sa buwan ng Pebrero kung saan ito ay naguhudyat ng mga panahon na kung saan meron na silang kailangan gawin pagdating sa pananim or sa pangingisda.
Nitulik na tawi-tawi. Ubos, na yan na nibiyaan, magbuhuma.
Na yaha kama saga anak kami. Ara po nito yati napapatabay man kambomboan. Sino pamandu makaam supaya katunan bi bang waktu ay kanaraing.
Na di kayo na ni harga ni kami pasaran lingta supaya kami kaluhayan. Ati nati siga na magkaluman tutu supaya tahati kami tinggal similan time. Ati na ya mag-uma, magtabas, magtuno, maka magtanom. Kus bang ati na ya bani jaga de kami minaan, di kayo na minaan takat ya tinanom kami.
Na asabay tasulay he siga bay magkarahu. Tagindan he sigala ya kahit karaing kakulang daing tagindan he sigala. Mana sa pinahaga he kami.
Ito yung mga indication ng kanilang knowledge system. Sa astronomy, they put them all together for their own safety. And they consider that as part of the overall behavior of their ancestors, yung umbo nila. They consider nature as part of their umbo, as part of their connection as the human being. So, dapat ang interplay is more on yung give and take. Kung anong maganda para sa nature, yun ang ginagawa nila. Kung ano ang ginagawa, anong maganda para sa kanila, yun din ang nasa isip nila, ang binibigay ng nature. Parang they enjoy the fruit of nature. They enjoy a good well-being while living because they were so good to nature.
Nalahaw lalagi sibaran minsan dua misik kulaon nahekola sa sinandalaon.
Now we'll go back to the presentation. Hold on, please. There you go. Okay, I hope I'm you can see my slides again, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So when you saw that video, and don't worry to our members of the audience who didn't understand the subtitles, because I'll be breaking them down in a while. Maraming nabanggit. There are several asterisms and star formations that were mentioned in the video. So let's break them down one by one. First of all, the most common was Balatic or Orion. One of the, although Ambrosio didn't say or hazard to guess why this is one of the most common in the sky, commonly known asterisms in the Philippines, we can hazard a guess that it was commonly known because of the particular brightness of the stars. If we look at the table of the apparent brightness of the various stars visible to the naked eye in the sky, the ones that form Orion are particularly bright, and they come in, if I'm not mistaken, the top 25 of the brightest stars with magnitudes if the sun is a magnitude 1, these are magnitude 2 to 3, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, they're very bright and very noticeable in the night sky. So it comes as no surprise that across the Philippines, various cultures speak of this particular cluster of stars. And of course, you have Orion's belt, which is particularly noticeable. So here we have a chart also from Dante Ambrosio's book, showing the different names of the asterism in the country. And you will notice that they're very similar to each other. Balatic in Tagalog, Balatic, Balatic in Bagobo, Bayatic sa mga Mandaya, Belatic sa mga Manobo. This also offers us a hint to just how closely related the languages are in the country. You'll remember when I said at the start of this talk that there is a lot of evidence showing our connection to the Great Austronesian expansion, right? This is proof of that, among other things. The archaeological linguistics looks at how words are close, how words diverge over time, and when keywords are close together, it indicates that there was at a relatively recent point in time that in the past that those cultures that use those words, that speak those languages, were connected to each other. So one of the people here who was interviewed, si Jakiri Mali, in his statement, he said that he didn't rely on the compass because sometimes it could be unreliable, and that he used the Balatic, among other constellations, to find his way. No, we will recall when he was talking about his experiences as a navigator within the area of Tawi-Tawi. He said that he would rely. He feels safe relying on the stars because they're always there. And this is something that Ambrosio also points to in his book on page 209. He says the Balatic itself as a constellation, as it moves across the sky, it happens to pass almost right overhead from the east to the west. So it can be used as a general indicator of east and west. No? But he also pointed out, and this was something that navigators are also aware of, that Balatic itself is not cannot be used as a clear indicator of direction, precisely because its movement varies over time across the sky. You know? Unlike, say, Polaris, which is a relatively fixed point in the northern sky. You know? But he also says that as long as you are aware of the relative positions of the stars relative to where you came from, it's easy to figure out your bearings. No? So here alone in this quote, and in the experiences of the navigators today in Tawi-Tawi, we see a very clear echo of the kind of thinking and the kind of knowledge systems that our ancestors and the Austronesian navigators had and still have today. You know, this idea that all of these things move about in a certain way that is interrelational. Remember when I talked about the map earlier? No? In the navigators' minds, the stars, the movement of the stars, and the patterns of the waves, the patterns of the islands around them, were all interrelated in this complex system of ideas and thoughts, no? In their minds. And this body of knowledge was what they relied on more than something external like a compass or a clock or a map. It was also mentioned earlier, yung bubu or Big Dipper. This was mentioned by Makapagalhangin when he said that he relied. The translation of what he said was that fishermen rely on bubu to tell them whether they will be able to catch a lot of fish or not. The way they do this is they look to the stars and they see if there are more stars visible in the night sky, then that means there are more fish to catch. Yan, as he says below, pag maraming bituin sa loob nito, maraming isda. Ambrosio says as much also, sangguniang bituin ng mga sama, ang bubu, the Big Dipper. It gives them an idea of when to fish. It makes sense because when you can see these stars, going back to the idea of magnitude, the stars that are visible there are past 3 to 4 orders of magnitude. So if you have a cloudy sky or atmospheric conditions aren't ideal, some of the stars in the sky would not be immediately visible. So that, of course, could indicate stormy weather. It could indicate unfavorable conditions, but it also points to the idea that, and this was some hypothesis that some marine biologists I talked to said was possible, that it could be that on a clear night, in a clear when there are clear skies, this attracts fish to the surface. Because microorganisms that are also attracted to light. So you have all of these organisms that are going up to the surface, so that makes them easier to catch. Also mentioned in the video was paliyama, which we know in the West as Aquila, the kite. And this was mentioned by Kennedy Ismail in his very beautiful story, which included a very interesting folktale about how the star patterns came to be where they were, particularly Paliama. To those of the audience who did not understand the video, basically the myth was that a family had a bountiful harvest, but when they left, basically when they left the earth, they decided to still maintain a way of keeping other people informed of how of when to plant and when to harvest, no? And that is what the Sama Dilaut see as Paliyama. But Ambrosio also talks about it and points out that in his studies, he found that there are 5 positions in the sky that Paliyama is in through the year, that that the Sama look to and helps them decide what to at what point to plant and what point to harvest. And we see that here. So in the Paliyama constellation appears near the horizon in January to if it appears near the horizon around January to April, that means it's time to clear the fields, and prepare for the plant for planting. Later in the year, in April or May, Paliyama is at its zenith up in the sky. That means the oncoming of the rainy season. So it's time to plant rice, for instance, right? And then when it is in the horizon again around September, that means the rainy season has shifted. It's starting to become the cold season, and it is more ideal to plant bananas and coconuts in around the month of September. Another constellation that we see coming up frequently in Ambrosio's work is Moroporo, and here are, or the Pleiades, and here are the various names for it that also appear across the various peoples of the Philippines. The Pleiades, or Moroporo, there's a possibility that this was also used in a similar way as mentioned earlier, yung Bubu, because the stars that make up this constellation are of varying magnitudes, ranging from, if I remember correctly, around 2 to as low as 4, and you can see even a lot more with the telescope. But what this does, because we have a range of magnitudes, what it does for people, it helps serve as a gauge to understand, to see how clear or how cloudy or to see the conditions of the sky, as it were, at any given time. So that also gives them information on whether they should set out to sea to fish, or it's a good day or night to plant or to go out into the field. So again, we go back to the idea that in the Philippines, we see through this video and through these examples that we did not rely on an external system of coordinates to tell us where the stars were, and we didn't and what these meant to us in terms of the changing seasons and atmospheric conditions. We relied on this relational system between concepts, thoughts, ideas that was conducive to being passed down through oral tradition. And as one physicist that I talked to, astrophysicist for that matter, Fisher Desherdo, said that the concept of time in the Philippines before the Europeans arrived really was not Newtonian. When we think of Newton and before Einstein, we think of this idea, because it's heavily influenced, of course, by Cartesian concepts, right? That all of these things that we're measuring, the things that we're measuring, physical things that we're measuring, be they stars or physical phenomena, are external to us, right? That by looking at the interrelationship outside of us, we can figure out what their movement will be moving forward. But as we've seen here, a lot of that interrelationship is internalized by practitioners of ethnoastronomy in the Philippines and elsewhere. And it involves a lot more than just where it involves a lot more than looking at a star and seeing whether it has gone from point A to point B. They're part of this whole interrelated, connected system that involves all the other senses as well as memory. And we also see, sorry, this should have come in earlier, the different names of the Pleiades. But anyway, the question now is, where do we find ourselves now as a people in the Philippines? What is our relationship with these traditions? What can we do with them? Where can we take them? No? For better or worse, but I would say in some ways for the better. No? To date, Dante Ambrosio's book remains the most comprehensive storehouse of information on ethnoastronomy in the Philippines. I like to think of it positively in the sense that it means that there's a lot more that we can explore and we should explore. So that, I think, is a challenge to all of you. I certainly see it as a challenge to myself to understand, to explore what traditions are out there and to document them and bring them together for future reference. No? There have been some points of study. For instance, Rochelle Masson of De La Salle University in 2017 wrote a very short paper, Star Catalogs and Star Maps in the Context of Philippine Ethnoastronomy. This is available for free online, I think on ResearchGate, you can look it up. Basically what he did was, jumping off from Ambrosio's work, he took it a step further and asked, is there enough information based on these oral traditions, based on indigenous knowledge as it was recorded by Ambrosio, to create comprehensive star charts, star catalogs, star maps? And his preliminary investigations say yes, it is possible, because the oral descriptions of the stars match fairly well with what is seen through a telescope, and matches what we know of the star patterns. So this is one of the challenges that we can do, and I certainly hope I can contribute to it in the future, and maybe some of you can also once conditions of this pandemic have lifted, when we're in better times, when we can actually go out and conduct really deep investigations, field research, to document to document further these star patterns and to create comprehensive star catalogs. Another bit of research I found very interesting was this paper, also available for free online, and I encourage you to download it, from Nicole Orteliano, just in 2019, from Rizal Technological University. This was her thesis, and she explored the praxis beliefs of the ETA in Zambales. And there was so much that she found out. Among other things, they have beliefs about meteors and asteroids, how when they fall to the when they see an asteroid fall to when they see a meteor in the sky, it has certain portents to them, depending on where they see it and how they see it fall. There's so much I can't go into it, but it's there. I hope you guys can download it. And to wrap up, these are the questions that we face. We are faced with the exciting task of decolonizing science. We know that the Philippines has been inhabited by seafarers for many thousands of years. The only way we could have survived these islands was through developing relatively complex systems of knowledge to help us navigate the waters, to help us know when to plant, uh, when to fish. These are very valid systems of thought and very valid bits of scientific knowledge. We should be careful not to dismiss indigenous knowledge, ethnic knowledge as outdated or useless in the modern age. Aside from exploring what's there, we can and should think about what we lost, what is out there for us to rediscover. We can also look at indigenous knowledge as working hand in hand with contemporary Western thought, no? Contemporary science as we know it, as it is taught to us through a Western framework. No? As I hope the slides showed, no? These ideas about the night sky, about ethnoastronomy in particular, is not in opposition to what we know about the stars from a Western framework. Actually, they are complementary and they enrich each other. And something also, food for thought, the last question is, we can also think, what would science look like had it been developed here instead of in the West? We are used to all of these structures of looking at the universe, the stars, the skies, from these Western perspectives. And they are valid, no? But one wonders how we would see the world and the universe and our place in it differently had we been able to develop our knowledge based on our own perspective as a people. And lastly, I touched on very briefly at the start of this, no, that the Philippines has its own writing systems, not just baybayin, but also reflective of the way that ethnoastronomy was used. No? This knowledge was passed down orally, and it was something that was internalized. In the same token, when the writing systems were used, it confounded the Europeans, it confounded the Spaniards, because they couldn't understand it even though they knew what each of the symbols represented. That was because a lot of the writing was contextual. What you're looking at here is how an ancient Tagalog would write a particular sentence, malaya tayo sa mga tala. It can also be read as maglayag tayo sa mga tala, because in the original traditional system, consonants were dropped when words were written out, and it was up to the writer and the reader, their shared commonality of experience, to understand the context of what they were saying. But I really love this phrase because it can be read as either "let us free ourselves among the stars," or "let us set sail among the stars." And perhaps to our ancestors, and I hope everyone here as well, I hope we can think of setting sail among the stars as also setting ourselves free among the stars. Yeah. And for further reading, online, you have Dante Ambrosius Balatic. There's also an overview of Polynesian wayfinding if you'd like to know more about it, from the University of Manoa at Hawaii, and my own thesis on the forgotten journeys of Philippines' ancient navigators on MIT's DSpace. And thank you very much.
Wow, grabe. Sir TJ. Sobrang ganda ng last message. So, thank you very much, no, Sir TJ. And I hope everyone enjoyed the great presentation. Now we will go ahead and take some time for the Q&A session. So we will answer questions that were sent during the presentation. So the first question is from Mr. Ramon Jefferson Verano. He said, "I've seen a lot of documentaries about ancient technologies. There are a lot of misunderstood technologies from ancient times. Do you think that the people from the past has a knowledge about space traveling, since they know already have the technology to determine different astronomical events?"
So I see, and I'm not surprised that there are fans among us of the Ancient Aliens series. No, frankly, I'm a fan too, but I look at it more as entertainment. I am skeptical of aliens having visited the Earth. I think my comment on that is um, the technology that we had at the time, at least as far as we know, right? We had the development of travel technology, the skills needed to develop, say, rocket fuel, the materials technology needed to develop then is relatively recent. No? The archaeological record does not show any indication of these materials having been invented long time ago. So I don't think that we were traveling to the stars in ancient times. But one thing that can be said for certain is that our ancestors and ancient peoples had a very complex knowledge of the stars and of the skies, more than we often give them credit for. Hindi sila mangmang, hindi rin sila naive o bobo. A lot of and if we look at ethnoastronomical traditions around the world, not just in the Philippines, we see that this is true. The Aztecs, the Mayans, even all the way to the Egyptians, which is the most famous example used by ancient aliens theorists. They had a very complex understanding of mathematics and physics, much more than we give them credit for. So yes, while we did not travel we most likely did not travel to the stars. Our ancestors certainly knew a lot more than we often think they did or give them credit for.
Well, thank you, Sir TJ. And then another question from Dr. Ernest Macalalad. So the question is, what is your reaction that there are learning materials being distributed by DepEd that aims to debunk ethnoastronomy ideas?
I am strongly against that for the reasons that I cited. Actually, I did see I think I did see that a document where that was mentioned, that debunking, and that's something that we need to debunk itself. Actually, na wag natin isipin na backwards ito. The problem is, of course, I'm not saying that all practices are valid. As science is a system of upgrading knowledge, right? When you see something that when you disprove something, you move on to a new hypothesis, right? And that's how that's how knowledge moves forward. So not all thoughts or ideas put forth before are valid, but it's wrong for us to summarily dismiss these entire bodies of knowledge as useless. Hindi magandang pananaw yung sabihin na makaluma yan, dapat i-debunk natin yan. As we've seen, 2 points, at least alone in this discussion, 2 points. Number one is we see that this way of ethnoastronomy is just as complex, if not in some ways more so, kasi you have to memorize things, than contemporary knowledge. And two, as we've seen based on the interviews, sometimes it is useful in occasions where modern technology is useless, right? In the case of the people of Tawi-Tawi, not all of them have GPS, and sometimes, as they said, minsan nagloloko pa yung yung instruments nila. So buti na lang they're able to utilize these oral traditions, this oral knowledge to help them find their way, right?
So I hope that Ed will reconsider those ideas.
Sorry, I just have to share. I just have to jump in kasi may follow-up question dun is it's in the chat thread. What could be the reasons why they want to debunk ethnoastronomy ideas? Kasi yun nga parang ang tingin ko nandun tayo kasi sa misunderstanding of technology as a linear progression of development, na porket bago siya at luma ito, hindi na yan pwede ngayon, 'di ba? So we should be careful of putting ourselves in that mindset. because we can look at ancient technologies and ancient knowledge, ancient science, as something that can complement our modern understanding of the universe and of the world.
Ayun, sobrang ano, tama po, sir. Ayun, so another question, sir, is there already, from Norman Danyes, is there already an existing constellation or star catalog in Tagalog?
To my knowledge, wala pa.
So another question from Oriel Tumanan. What does the research suggest about the factors and reasons why some of our ancestors migrated out of the Philippines instead of staying in our island? Thank you so much.
Oh, that's a very good question. And I honestly don't have an answer to that. I'm sorry, it escapes me at the moment kung saan ko nabasa, but that is a lingering question. That's a lingering question on researchers' minds, no, kung bakit tayo lumuwas pa. Kasi nga naman, I mean, one way of looking at it is the Philippines has abundant resources, ang biro nga, di ba? Maglaglag ka lang ng buto dyan sa tabi, tutubo na yan, di ba? I mean, it's clear that we have abundant natural resources, so why this push to move outwards? One hypothesis that I have personally is it could be trying to put myself in the shoes of ancient peoples, is we see the sun rising in the east, and we also notice that typhoons, diba, also come from the east relative to us. Fish also come in through that we see wave patterns coming in. So two things. Number one is, one way of looking at it, I think, this is not scientific, this is just my own thought on that one, but just trying to put myself, and you can do this exercise too, no? Thinking about it as a person in that time. One way of looking at it is posible na iniisip mo, siguro nandun yung biyaya, nandun yung whatever our thought of paradise is over there, diba? And our mythologies a hint at this, no? Global mythologies also point in this similar direction. Now we tend to think of the West as the place of death because that's where the sun sets. Corollary, a lot of cultures outside of the Philippines also think of the East as the place where the gods reside because that's where the sun rises in the morning each day, diba? So, posibleng ganun yung naiisip ng mga tao noon, na doon sa malayo, doon umangat ang araw, siguro andun yung lupain ng mga ninuno ko, yung mga yumao kong ninuno, posibleng nandun sila. My ancestors might be there. That could be one way. Or it could be simply, hey, all of these fish are coming from that direction, so maybe I should go there because if I can catch a lot of fish here, maybe it's easier to catch fish there. We don't know. But those are just some ideas.
Yeah. So we're down to last three questions. So from Rafael Mendiha, what are the main contributions of the indigenous knowledge systems of the constellations in modern astronomy? Is it true that the modern astronomy, with its emphasis on the Western system of thought, has displayed indigenous knowledge systems like ethnoastronomy?
To a large extent, yes, no? Because a lot of the knowledge systems that we use are come to us from the West. But thankfully, in recent years there has been a push to decolonize and to recenter, as it were, our approach to science, no? In the sense that, and as we've seen, as I've been trying to show dito, no, na one of the key takeaways that we see from this is that our ancestors and even today's indigenous peoples understanding of the stars and of their environment is something that is internalized, no? They don't necessarily see the world as something out there to be conquered or to be fought over and to be put under control. It is something that we have a relationship with, a communion with, no? And this has a lot of implications on our own attitude towards the world and how we move about and how we live our daily lives. So it's not so much an idea of erasing or taking away what we've learned from Western thought, but complementing it with our own perspectives and alternate perspectives.
Okay. So from Samuel Oswald Abayan, with the research that has been done with ethnoastronomy in the Philippines, does that also determine that the pre-Spanish civilization in our country very advanced?
Without a doubt, yes. And I say this beyond just the idea of ethnoastronomy. One thing that I was not able to touch on, and you can probably look it up when you see if you download my thesis, was that my thesis. I mean that literally in the document, and generally my approach to all of this is that because of the Philippines location, and as I said earlier, diba, that it was always cut off by seas. It's been relatively difficult to get to, unlike sa ibang lugar na you can walk down land masses, diba? So that indicates, if not directly, then at least the possibility that people needed to develop technologies and ways of navigating, ways of surviving this environment. No? And we see that the indicators today are these complex ideas of ethnoastronomy and these indigenous practices that we've touched on. Even the way we build boats. That's something that I would have loved to talk about further but was not able to. Pag tinignan natin yung mga balangay that were unearthed in Butuan, they are very complex actually. They're not just, kuha ka ng kahoy, butasan mo, tas yun, lalayag ka na. No? They were actually very intricately carved in a very certain way, tied together in a very particular way. They're called plank, lugged edge. I forgot the term, but they're put together in a very particular way that involves a lot of work. And what this does is it makes them flexible, it makes them adaptable. They could be used in shallow waters and deep waters as well. They were the boats back in the day, the balangays, were so technologically advanced actually that they rivaled, that they could go around the Spanish ships. Plasencia and I think Pigafetta also say as much, that the boats were so high tech for their time that the carracks, the Spanish carracks, couldn't keep up with them, and the Spanish ships were having difficulty navigating our waters. Filipinos could carry the balangay on their shoulders, put it into the waters, move about in shallow and deep water. It could even go quickly in either direction. There's also evidence that until relatively recent times, Palau, way off in the middle of the Pacific and the Philippines, madalas na bumabiyahe yung mga tao, mga indigenous peoples, to and from these areas with ease using boats that they made by hand. So yes, technology of these times was markedly different and advanced.
Yeah. From Jeremy Jamboy, medyo ancient aliens na yung question. Was there ever a chance or some findings in which our ancestors communicated with ET or extraterrestrial beings, aside from being just using the stars for agriculture?
The problem that I have with this idea of ancient aliens, I have to admit, I'm a fan. I'm a fan, but I enjoy it more as entertainment. And my problem kasi with this idea of ancient aliens is that the main idea is that kaya umunlad yung mga sinaunang tao is because aliens brought this technology to us. Pero hindi ba pwedeng tayo yung nag-develop on our own? Could we not have developed these ideas, this technology, by our own means? I think I was about to say that I sometimes find it an insult, but maybe that's too harsh a term. I think one way of putting it politely is that bringing aliens into the picture is a disservice to our ancestors because it supposes that they could not have they could not have thought critically, they could not have thought in such complex ideas on their own without outside help. But the evidence shows that they did on their own. No? A lot of the things that ancient aliens point to as evidence, quote unquote, that aliens brought this technology to us can be easily explained by traditional archaeological and historical methods. That these people developed these bodies of technology, of knowledge and systems of technology over hundreds of years, several generations on their own. So yeah, they were smarter than we give them credit for.
Yun. Yeah, tama naman, no? Question last. Do they also include the moon as a navigation guide, or is it only for star constellations by Charmaine Marie Varilla?
The moon kasi, I think I will defer to the more expert astronomers in this audience and among PAGASA, no, but generally nagbabago kasi yung itsura ng buwan. It's used generally across cultures of the world more as an indicator of time. Just like I mentioned earlier, in the same way that balatik can be generally used as an indicator of direction. The moon can also generally be used as an indicator of direction, but it's not precise. Kasi if you think about it, the path of the moon, parang in the same way that we use the sun, right? If you know it's morning and you see the sun in a portion of the sky, then you know that's the east, or hapon na tapos palubog na yung araw. Oy, yun dun, that's the west, right? So because you know the movement of the sun and also the moon across the sky over a certain period of time, you have a general idea of directions, but it's not as precise as going to the extreme naman, no? Looking at how the Austronesian navigators did it. Memoryado nila moment to moment, day to day, time to time. Pagtingin mo sa horizon, kung ano yung nakita mong tuldok dun sa malayo, uy, ito yung star na yon. So therefore, I am facing in this particular direction. That is much more precise and uses a much more complex and advanced way of thinking than just using the moon as a reference. But it's possible, very broadly speaking.
Ayun. So our last question, Sir TJ, and siguro pang wrap up na rin, no? So what can you, from Ashley Mendoza, what can you say to people, or what advice can you give to people who are interested to study astronomy or ethnoastronomy, who are clueless on how to begin or where to begin? Thank you in advance.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the question, because it was also a position that I was in just 4 years ago when I started my thesis. Balatik, Dante Ambrosio's book Balatik, which is available at the UP Press, and shortened version is also available online. Just Google it. It's a good place to start. But once you look through it, dun mo ma-realize na ang dami pang pwedeng aralin, ang dami pang pwedeng puntahan. So yeah, that's a good jump off point. Another thing that you can look at on a global stage naman is the concept of indigenous science, ethnic science. It goes by various terms. It's sometimes called ethnic science, indigenous science. Ethnoastronomy is a part of that. But the general idea is that ancient peoples, indigenous peoples, built up these systems of knowledge of looking at the world that are scientific in their own way, in their own right, and they offer alternative views of looking at the world. So that's something that you can explore. There's a lot of literature out there. Kahit i-google mo lang yung ethnic science, indigenous science, ang dami mo makuha. There is, I think, in the University of California, San Diego, if I'm not mistaken, I forgot the website and the particular institute there, but they even went so far as to document and look at traditions ng Native Americans and to look at them through this framework. So there's a lot out there. But specific to the Philippines, as I mentioned earlier, there's so much that needs to be done, and that's something that I would like to be a part of. And I encourage everyone, in your own communities. And kung meron sa inyong gusto mag-anthropology or archaeology, go for it. We need more people to unearth our past, to understand our past. And even if you are going into, say, astronomy, or if you also want to go like Nico, be a full-time astronomer and be a part of PAGASA, there's still a place for all of this with us, no? Because this ties us to a long tradition of ethnoastronomy. It ties us to our past as a people. Yeah.
Thank you, Sir TJ. So it looks like we have covered up all our questions. So is there anything else you want to cover, Mr. TJ, before wrapping up?
I guess that's it. Thank you, Rose. By the way, kinoment niya dito sa thread. You may check the JH journal for additional reference for ethnoastronomy. Yeah. So that's one among many. But yan, kung sa Philippine Ethnoastronomy mismo, yun, Dante's book is the place to start.
Ayan. Okay, so let's give him a round of applause now. So great, thank you again, Mr. TJ Dimacali, for answering those questions and for a great presentation. It was a pleasure being with you today. So we will now proceed with the awarding of the certificate of our appreciation to Mr. TJ Dimacali. So the certificate reads, Republic of the Philippines, Department of Science and Technology, Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical, and Astronomical Service Administration. Certificate of Appreciation is awarded to Timothy James M. Dimacali in recognition for his contribution as a resource speaker for the webinar entitled Ethnoastronomy in the Philippines in celebration of 100 hours of astronomy held on October 1 to 4 of October 2021, given this first day of October 2021 via Google Meet, signed by Vicente V. Malano, PhD, PAGASA Administrator.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope you all start exploring, and I hope this encourages you all to make your own explorations.
Yeah. So to our participants, you can now access the link to the survey form sent in the chat box. Please accomplish the form by 7 p.m. A certificate of attendance will be emailed to you shortly. Thank you for sharing your time with us. At this junction, we will hear a closing message from the Chief of the Research and Development and Training Division, Dr. Nathaniel P. Servando.
Good day, everyone. Before we conclude the program for this afternoon, we in PAGASA would like to express our thanks to Mr. Timothy James Dimacali for his interesting and inspiring talk about ethnoastronomy in the Philippines, and for taking a time out of his busy schedule to be with us this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Dimacali. Today's discussion actually showcased the rich ancient Filipino culture, and I am certain that all of us who attended this session learned a lot from the discussion. This is a good opportunity to know and to be more acquainted with our history and culture, as it provides a deeper essence of our identity as a nation and as Filipinos. This learning from the past should not be forgotten. I agree with Mr. Dimacali, and instead be flourished, disseminated, and popularized among Filipinos of all ages. It is good to know that the legacy of Dr. Dante Ambrosio, the father of Philippine ethnoastronomy, is being continued and being presented today by Mr. Dimacali to a wider audience, not only to Filipinos, but also to our international friends, because this event is actually sponsored by the International Astronomical Union through the Office of Astronomy Outreach. I would like to commend the continuous efforts of PAGASA's, particularly the Space Science and Astronomy Section, SSAS personnel, through the leadership of Ms. Tat Ramos, for organizing outreach and astronomy promotional and popularization events such as this activity this afternoon. Through Ms. Ramos and her staff, we have conducted a number of online astronomy seminars during the past few weeks with a wider online audience involving astronomy enthusiasts, undergraduate students, and even teachers. In fact, another important webinar is scheduled next week in line with our celebration of the World Space Week 2021. Renewed Filipinas actually working in the space sector are invited as motivational speakers. We are looking forward for your support in this event and in other future astro webinars. Have a great and safe weekend ahead to everyone. Thank you.
Ayan. So thank you, Dr. Servando. To wrap things up, we would like to request everyone to turn on their camera.